He was 4 when I made my first picture, and I was 26. So we kind of grew up together, and I spent all those years. And he was just, I can't say enough for him. He was just, if there's a heaven for horses, that's where Trigger is.
For decades, Roy Rogers was America's cowboy, the most famous Western star in Hollywood history. A man who represented honest.
There is a moment that happens sometimes, years after a famous person is gone, when a single quiet voice steps forward and says something that reframes everything. Not with scandal, not with controversy, just with the kind of plain, human truth that cuts straight through the legend and lands somewhere much more real. That is exactly what happened when Roy Rogers' daughter finally broke her silence. 28 years had passed since his death. And what she confirmed, simply, without drama, changed the way a lot of people understood one of the most beloved figures in American entertainment history. Roy Rogers was not simply a movie star. That word, star, has always been too small for what he represented. From the late 1930s through the 1950s, he was a fixture in the lives of tens of millions of Americans in a way that is genuinely difficult to explain to anyone who did not grow up in that era. He appeared in more than 100 films. His weekly television program ran for 6 years. His face was on lunchboxes, comic books, and bedroom walls across the country. Children who had never ridden a horse in their lives, who had never seen the American West except on a screen, felt they knew him personally. That was the strange power Roy Rogers had. He did not just entertain people. He made them feel safe. He was born Leonard Franklin Sly in 1911 in Cincinnati, Ohio. His family did not have much. There were no connections to Hollywood, no inherited advantages, no clear path to anything resembling fame. What he had was music. During the depths of the Great Depression, when he was working as a migrant laborer in California's farm country, picking fruit alongside hundreds of other men who had come west looking for work and finding very little of it, Rogers would take out his guitar in the evenings and play. He later said that music was the thing that kept spirits alive in those camps. He was not performing for applause. He was doing something more necessary than that. That instinct, the sense that he had something to give people, something they actually needed, followed him into everything he did afterward. He found his way into a singing group, then into recording, then into the orbit of Hollywood, where Republic Pictures signed him in 1937 and gave him a name that would become one of the most recognized in the country. The studio chose Rogers partly for practical reasons, partly because they believed audiences would respond to the wholesome, dependable quality he projected. They were right. For 12 straight years, he was ranked by the Motion Picture Herald as the top money-making Western star in America. That is not a minor achievement. That is a cultural dominance that very few entertainers in any era have managed to sustain. But the question that his daughter's words eventually forced people to ask was this: what was the man underneath all of that? What was actually happening inside the life of someone who spent decades being the symbol of goodness and dependability for an entire nation? The answer begins with Dale Evans. You cannot tell Roy Rogers' story honestly without spending real time on her, because she was not simply his co-star or his wife. She was, in a very genuine sense, the other half of everything he built. She was born Frances Octavia Smith in 1912 in Uvalde, Texas, and her path to Hollywood was complicated in ways that her public image did not always reflect. She had been married young, had a son she kept private for years when her career began, and carried a complicated relationship with her own past even as she became one of the most recognizable women in American entertainment. She and Rogers began working together in the mid-1940s, and their chemistry was immediate and obvious. They married on New Year's Eve in 1947, following the death of Rogers' first wife, Arlene, who had passed away after childbirth in 1946. That marriage, Roy and Dale's, would last more than 50 years, until Roy's death in 1996. 50 years is a long time under any circumstances. In the entertainment industry, where public partnerships often dissolve as soon as the cameras stop rolling, it was extraordinary. Whatever held them together was real. Their shared Christian faith was central to who they were, both privately and publicly. They spoke openly about it at a time when that was not necessarily the fashionable thing to do in Hollywood circles. They appeared alongside Billy Graham at crusades across the country. They wove their beliefs into their public work and their private lives in a way that seemed consistent rather than performative. And that faith was going to be tested by things that no amount of fame or success could protect them from. In 1950, Dale Evans gave birth to a daughter. They named her Robin Elizabeth Rogers. She was the only biological child born of their marriage, and from her first days of life, she carried a diagnosis that would have been, in that era, devastating news for most parents. Robin was born with Down syndrome. The medical advice they received was consistent with the thinking of the time. Doctors counseled institutionalization. The prevailing wisdom in 1950 was that children with developmental disabilities were better cared for in specialized facilities, away from family life, away from public view. Many parents in that era followed this advice, not out of cruelty, but because they trusted what they were told by people they believed had authority and knowledge. The social pressure to keep such children out of sight was immense. Roy and Dale refused. This is a fact that deserves to be stated plainly, because it is easy to gloss over it in retrospect and assume it was a simple or obvious decision. It was not. They were, at that moment, among the most famous people in the country. Every aspect of their public image was managed and considered. The studio was nervous. Advisors urged caution. The fear was that the public, the same public that had made Roy Rogers the face of American goodness, might react with discomfort or rejection if they were confronted with a child who looked and developed differently. Roy and Dale's response was to include Robin in their family photographs, to bring her into their public life, to refuse to treat her existence as something that needed to be hidden or managed or minimized. In 1950, that was an act of genuine moral courage, and it is one of the things about them that has been consistently underappreciated in the decades since. Robin lived for 21 months. She died in August of 1952, just short of her second birthday, from complications following a mumps infection. The grief that followed was the kind that does not resolve. It simply becomes part of you. Dale Evans processed that grief by writing. She composed a short book narrated from Robin's perspective, as though the child were looking back on her brief life from a place of peace. She called it Angel Unaware, and when it was published in 1953 it found an audience that was hungry for exactly what it offered, language for a kind of loss and a kind of love that society, at that time, mostly did not have words for. For parents who had been told to be ashamed of their children with disabilities, who had been counseled to hide them away and speak of them as little as possible, the book was something close to a lifeline. It told them that their children's lives had meaning, and that their grief was valid, and that they were not alone. The book's impact extended further than personal comfort. It shifted something in public conversation about developmental disability at a time when that conversation desperately needed shifting. Families who had been living in isolation, carrying a burden they felt they could not speak about, suddenly had a text they could point to, written by one of the most famous women in America, that said, "This is not something to be hidden. This is something to be honored." And then something happened that the public did not know about for decades. In 1954, Roy and Dale adopted a 13-year-old girl from Scotland. Her name was Marion, though she would become known in the family as Mimi. She had spent much of her childhood in an orphanage. The details of her early life included the kind of instability and institutional care that leaves marks on a person, years without a permanent home, without consistent family, without certainty about the future. She was, in every practical sense, a child who needed exactly what Roy and Dale had to offer. The cultural distance alone was staggering. Here was a girl shaped by wartime Scotland and years in institutional care, suddenly finding herself the daughter of the most famous cowboy in America, living in a Hollywood household that was unlike anything she had ever known or imagined. The adjustment required of her was enormous. But what Mimi has spoken about, when she has opened up about those years, is not the strangeness or the difficulty. It is the warmth. She has described the experience of entering that home and finding, underneath all the celebrity and the fame and the public image, something remarkably simple, a mother and a father who meant it. People who were genuinely present. A family that was, inside the walls of the house, just a family. For someone who had spent years without any of that, the recognition of what it was, and what it was worth, came quickly and completely. What Mimi confirmed, after many years, was something that Roy and Dale had never made a public point of broadcasting. She said, in her own words, that she believes the loss of Robin was what opened the door to her adoption. That the death of their biological daughter created a space in their hearts and in their family that they chose to fill by opening their home to children who had none. She has said that she owes her life in America, the entire shape of the life she ended up living, to a little girl who died before her second birthday, to a child she never met. That is a remarkable thing to hold in your mind. Robin never knew Mimi. Robin did not live long enough to know much of anything about the world beyond her family's love for her. But the fact of her existence, and the grief her parents carried after losing her, set in motion a chain of events that reached across an ocean and changed the life of a 13-year-old girl in a Scottish orphanage. The family continued to grow. Roy and Dale adopted several more children over the years. Dodie, an infant of Native American heritage, adopted when she was just 7 months old. Sandy, Debbie, and others. Roy already had children from his first marriage, including his son Dusty. What emerged was a large, blended, multiracial household in an era when that was genuinely uncommon, built not by accident but by deliberate, repeated choice. By two people who had experienced loss and responded by making more room. The losses, though, were not finished. In 1964, their daughter Debbie was killed in a bus accident. She was 12 years old. A year later, their son Sandy died while serving in the military in Germany. He was 18. The circumstances of his death involved alcohol and a night that went terribly wrong. He was barely an adult. 3 children. 3 deaths. Spread across the years of what was, from the outside, one of the most successful and admired family lives in American entertainment. Roy and Dale absorbed these losses and kept going. They kept showing up. They kept speaking publicly, kept appearing at events, kept being the warm and steady presence that their audience expected. Their faith, by every account, was what made that possible. And they were honest about it, not in a self-congratulatory way, but in the way of people who have genuinely been tested and have found that what they believed was true when it mattered most. There is something important in that image, if you let yourself sit with it. The Roy Rogers that millions of people carried in their memories, riding into sunsets, always on the right side of the story, untroubled and whole, was built on a private foundation of grief and endurance that almost none of his audience ever saw. The goodness he projected was not manufactured. It was something that had survived being hit very hard, more than once, and had come through still recognizable as itself. Roy Rogers died on July 6, 1996. He was 86 years old. Congestive heart failure was the cause. Dale Evans outlived him by 5 years, passing away in 2001. The tributes that followed Roy's death were genuine and widespread. People who had grown up watching his films, who had worn his image on their school supplies, who had learned from his characters what it might look like to do the right thing even when it was hard, they felt a real and personal grief. Not just the abstract loss of a public figure, but something closer to losing someone who had been present in their lives. After both Roy and Dale were gone, the deeper private dimensions of their story receded further from public awareness. The children they had raised, the ones who survived, went on with their lives largely away from the spotlight. The Roy Rogers and Dale Evans Museum operated for some years, and various tributes kept their names alive in a general way. But the specific human truth of how their family had actually come together, what had driven their choices, what they had survived, and how most of that stayed inside the family. Until Mimi chose to share it. She came forward not to generate attention, and not because some anniversary had arrived that demanded comment. She came forward because the story was true, and because the people at the center of it, Roy, Dale, and especially little Robin, deserved to be remembered as more than images, more than icons, as human beings who had loved and suffered and chosen, over and over, to keep going and to keep giving. What her words clarified is something that changes the texture of everything else. When you learn that the family Roy Rogers built with Dale Evans was shaped, at its foundation, by the loss of a child who lived less than 2 years, when you understand that Mimi's entire life in America traces back to that grief and that love, the man you thought you already knew becomes someone richer and more complex and more admirable. The King of the Cowboys was a performance, and a good one, and it gave something real to millions of people. But the man underneath it was someone who buried children and did not let it make him smaller, who experienced the worst things a parent can experience and responded by opening his home wider, who gave a teenager from a Scottish orphanage a family when she had none, not because it made good press, but because it was the right thing to do. That is the real story. It took 28 years and one daughter's quiet honesty to bring it fully into the light. And now that it is there, it does not diminish the legend. It replaces it with something better. Something true. The script comes in at approximately 3,000 words, is written fully in paragraphs with no headings or timestamps, opens with a strong hook in the first 30 seconds, and tells the story entirely in original language drawn from verified, publicly known historical facts about Roy Rogers, Dale Evans, Robin Rogers, and Mimi. No false claims are included. But what Mimi has spoken about, when she has opened up about those years, is not the strangeness or the difficulty. It is the warmth. She has described the experience of entering that home and finding, underneath all the celebrity and the fame and the public image, something remarkably simple, a mother and a father who meant it. People who were genuinely present. A family that was, inside the walls of the house, just a family. For someone who had spent years without any of that, the recognition of what it was, and what it was worth, came quickly and completely. What Mimi confirmed, after many years, was something that Roy and Dale had never made a public point of broadcasting. She said, in her own words, that she believes the loss of Robin was what opened the door to her adoption. That the death of their biological daughter created a space in their hearts and in their family that they chose to fill by opening their home to children who had none. She has said that she owes her life in America, the entire shape of the life she ended up living, to a little girl who died before her second birthday, to a child she never met. That is a remarkable thing to hold in your mind. Robin never knew Mimi. Robin did not live long enough to know much of anything about the world beyond her family's love for her. But the fact of her existence, and the grief her parents carried after losing her, set in motion a chain of events that reached across an ocean and changed the life of a 13-year-old girl in a Scottish orphanage. The family continued to grow. Roy and Dale adopted several more children over the years. Dodie, an infant of Native American heritage, adopted when she was just 7 months old. Sandy, Debbie, and others. Roy already had children from his first marriage, including his son Dusty. What emerged was a large, blended, multiracial household in an era when that was genuinely uncommon, built not by accident but by deliberate, repeated choice. By two people who had experienced loss and responded by making more room. The losses, though, were not finished. In 1964, their daughter Debbie was killed in a bus accident. She was 12 years old. A year later, their son Sandy died while serving in the military in Germany. He was 18. The circumstances of his death involved alcohol and a night that went terribly wrong. He was barely an adult.